My name is Rebecca Foster, 36 years old, a senior attorney at one of New York's most prestigious law firms, Blake and Foster. Ever since I was a little girl, I was filled with curiosity about the towering skyscrapers in the photos my father brought back from his business trips. New York, in my childhood imagination, was a magical place where dreams could become reality. I remember vividly the first time I set foot in the city, fresh out of law school. Standing in the middle of Times Square, I gazed up at the dazzling neon lights and thought to myself that I had found the place where I truly belonged. This city became my heartbeat, and I swore to do whatever it took to succeed here. Years of relentless work turned me from a junior associate into one of the most respected lawyers in the field. I've won major cases, representing high-profile clients ranging from leading financial corporations to Hollywood celebrities. People often describe me as tough, cold, and unyielding, but I know that beneath this exterior lies a woman with dreams and aspirations. I've sacrificed much, including love and personal happiness, to reach this position. Yet, despite achieving everything I had ever hoped for, there was still an emptiness that lingered within me, a void I couldn't seem to fill. I once thought it was the price of ambition, a price I was willing to pay for the sake of my career. But everything changed on that fateful day when I met a man I never expected to encounter, let alone fall for. Alexander Shaw, the governor of New York, a powerful man admired and feared by all who knew him. He wasn't just the leader of one of America's most influential states, he was the epitome of power and political finesse. With his calm demeanor and piercing gaze, Alexander Shaw exuded a confidence and decisiveness that only comes from weathering countless political storms. I had read countless articles about him, about his bold reform policies, and his approach to governing the state like a large enterprise, always putting the citizens' interests first. But no amount of reading could have prepared me for the moment I first met him face to face. He embodied an undeniable power, a magnetic charm unlike anyone I had ever met before. And in that very moment, I realized my life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. I had always thought of myself as someone in control of my work, my career, my personal life. Yet, in just a single glance, Alexander Shaw made me question everything. He was not merely a governor. He was the man who shattered the defenses I had meticulously built over the years, making my heart race in a way that seemed impossible. Little did I know, from that moment on, I would be drawn into a forbidden romance, where every decision I made could lead us both to ruin. It was a relationship I knew would be fraught with danger and challenges, but one that I could not turn away from. It all began at a grand fundraising gala hosted by the Democratic Party of New York. The event was a lavish affair held in one of the most exclusive ballrooms in Manhattan, the type of place where the chandeliers sparkled like constellations against a deep, indigo sky. I had been assigned to oversee the legal documentation for the evening, contracts, sponsorship agreements, and the delicate legal nuances that accompany large political donations. The entire city's elite had gathered, from prominent business leaders and celebrities to the most influential political figures. This was the kind of event where alliances were forged, secrets exchanged behind closed doors, and where even the smallest gesture could carry the weight of a future campaign. It was a crisp October evening, and the city outside was bathed in the golden hues of autumn. I had chosen a sleek, black dress for the occasion, understated but elegant, hoping to blend into the background and observe rather than be noticed. The room buzzed with energy as servers moved deftly between the guests, balancing trays of champagne glasses and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Conversations filled the space with a low hum, a mix of laughter, political gossip, and the sound of clinking glasses. Then, everything changed when Alexander Shaw entered the room. He didn't need to make a grand entrance. There were no trumpets, no official announcement, yet the very atmosphere of the room shifted as if the air itself recognized his presence. Conversation ceased, and a collective hush fell over the crowd. It was as though an invisible wave had swept through, drawing every eye towards the tall, charismatic figure making his way through the doorway. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blue suit that complemented his broad shoulders and gave him an air of effortless authority. I had heard stories about his magnetism before, tales from colleagues who had met him during legal briefings or political functions. They spoke of his charm, his razor-sharp wit, and the way he commanded attention without saying a word. But those were just stories, anecdotes passed around like rumors, never quite capturing the essence of what it felt like to be in his presence. Now, standing across the room from him, I finally understood what they meant. Alexander Shaw was not just a man, he was a force. There was an intensity about him that was palpable, something that went beyond his polished appearance or his carefully cultivated public image. It was in the way he carried himself, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, yet was tempered by an easy smile and a twinkle in his eye that suggested he was in on a joke the rest of us had yet to understand. As he moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging brief pleasantries, he glanced in my direction. Our eyes met for the briefest of moments, but it was enough. I felt a jolt, as if I'd been struck by lightning. It was a look that lingered, a fleeting moment that seemed to stretch out infinitely. In his gaze, I saw something unexpected, a curiosity, a flicker of recognition, as though he was as surprised by the connection as I was. The rest of the evening became a blur of faces and conversations, but my focus was entirely on him. I tried to distract myself by engaging in small talk with other guests, but my mind kept drifting back to Alexander Shaw. I watched him from the corner of the room as he made his way to the podium. He took his time, not in a hurry to claim the spotlight, because he knew it was already his. The room fell into a reverent silence as he prepared to speak. When he finally addressed the crowd, his voice was deep, resonant, carrying the kind of conviction that could sway even the most skeptical listener. He spoke about the importance of unity, about the challenges facing the state, and the need for bold, decisive action. There was no teleprompter, no prepared script. He spoke from the heart, and the audience hung on his every word. It was clear that he was more than just a politician, he was a leader, someone who could inspire hope and trust with nothing more than his presence and his voice. I found myself leaning forward, captivated not only by his words, but by the man himself. He was everything I had imagined and more, confident, articulate, and undeniably charismatic. But there was something else, something beneath the surface, that I couldn't quite put my finger on. A sense of weariness, perhaps, or a longing that didn't fit the image of the powerful, invincible governor he portrayed to the world. After the applause subsided and the crowd began to disperse, I busied myself with the paperwork and documents spread across the table in front of me. It was a faint attempt at focus, a way to regain my composure after the intense, almost electric moment when our eyes had met. I knew I couldn't let my guard down. This was still a professional event, and I needed to maintain my role as the objective, disciplined attorney that everyone expected me to be. But as I felt his presence approaching, my heart began to race, betraying me. I could sense him before I saw him, a quiet magnetism that seemed to draw the very air around us into a different kind of silence. When I looked up, there he was, standing just a few feet away, his hands casually in his pockets, yet his eyes locked onto mine with a gaze that was both intense and disarming. "Rebecca Foster, right?" he said with a smile, his voice warm yet carrying the authority of a man used to being listened to. He extended his hand, and without thinking, I reached out to take it. His grip was firm but gentle, a handshake that conveyed strength without needing to exert it. "Yes, that's me," I replied, my voice steadier than I had expected, though I could feel a slight tremble in my fingers. "It's an honor to meet you, Governor Shaw." He tilted his head slightly, studying me as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle. "I've heard a great deal about your work," he continued. "Your recent victory in the corporate litigation case against Ryder Industries was quite impressive. Not many lawyers could have pulled off a win like that against such a formidable opponent." I felt a flush of pride mixed with surprise. The Ryder Industries case had been one of the most challenging of my career, a high-stakes battle involving millions of dollars and a client whose reputation was on the line. I had spent months preparing for it, meticulously going through every piece of evidence, every legal argument, and had managed to secure a landmark victory that made headlines in legal circles. But I never imagined that a man like Alexander Shaw, the governor of New York, would know about it, let alone mention it in such a casual manner. "Thank you," I said, managing a small smile. It was a team effort, really. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. He raised an eyebrow, as if he didn't quite believe my modesty. Is that so? He asked, his tone laced with a hint of amusement. From what I've heard, it was your cross-examination that turned the case around. You had their CEO stumbling over his own words, practically admitting to the charges, before he realized what was happening. I couldn't help but laugh, a genuine, unguarded moment that felt strangely intimate, given the setting. You've done your research, Governor, I said, meeting his gaze head-on for the first time. There was a spark in his eyes, a flicker of something unspoken, and I felt a thrill run through me that I couldn't ignore. Call me Alex, he replied, his voice dropping to a softer, more personal tone. It was as though we had stepped out of the crowded ballroom and into a private conversation, the noise and bustle of the event fading into the background. And yes, I tend to do my homework, especially when it comes to people who are making waves in this city. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. There was a familiarity in the way he spoke to me, a sense of recognition that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. This was the first time we had met, yet it felt like he knew me, or at least, he wanted to know me. He wasn't just engaging in polite small talk, he was interested, in a way that went beyond mere curiosity. What brings you to this event? He asked, leaning slightly closer, lowering his voice as if he were sharing a secret. I don't often see attorneys of your caliber mingling at fundraisers like this. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the way my pulse was racing. My firm was asked to handle the legal arrangements for tonight, I explained. I'm here to make sure everything runs smoothly, contracts, donations, compliance. It's not exactly glamorous work, but it's necessary. He nodded, a smile playing at the corner of his lips. Necessary, yes. But also important. You're making sure that everything is done above board, keeping everyone honest. That's a rare quality in this city. I couldn't help but smile back. And you, Alex? You seemed quite at home up there. I gestured towards the podium where he had delivered his speech. It's clear you have the crowd in the palm of your hand. He gave a small shrug, as if it were no big deal. Part of the job, he said lightly. But it's not the crowd I'm interested in tonight. There was a moment of silence, a charged, breathless pause where the air seemed to thicken between us. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the unknown, knowing that one step could send me plunging into a freefall from which I might never recover. He was looking at me with a kind of intensity that I hadn't felt in years, not since I could remember. Rebecca, he said softly, his voice almost a whisper now. There's something about you. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I'd like to find out. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I was completely disarmed, caught off guard by his directness, his candor. This wasn't a flirtation, wasn't a game. He was speaking to me like he already knew what he wanted, and he wasn't afraid to go after it. Just then, a loud laugh from a nearby group broke the spell. He glanced over his shoulder, then back at me, his expression shifting back to the composed, polished politician everyone knew. I should go, he said reluctantly. But this isn't the end of our conversation, Rebecca. I look forward to seeing you again. Before I could say anything, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving me standing there, stunned and breathless. My hand still tingled from where he had touched it, and I realized I was trembling. For a moment, I was caught between two conflicting emotions, the excitement of a connection that felt electric, and the cold, sinking realization that I had just stepped into a world of danger and intrigue. This was a game I wasn't prepared to play, but it was already too late. I had been noticed by the most powerful man in the state, and I knew that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. Our initial encounter felt like the strike of a match, sudden and intense, igniting something neither of us could ignore. What began as an exchange of glances and a handshake at a crowded event quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. The first time we met in private was only a week after the fundraising gala. It happened so naturally, almost as if we had planned it all along, though I knew how reckless it was. The stakes were higher than I had ever experienced before, but the pull I felt towards Alex was unlike anything I had ever known. We chose a small, unassuming apartment in the East Village, far from the skyscrapers and limelight of Midtown Manhattan. It was a nondescript building, hidden amongst the coffee shops and vintage stores that lined the quiet street. The apartment itself was simple: a modest living room, a tiny kitchen, and a large window that overlooked the city's bustling streets below. It was a place he could retreat to, a sanctuary away from the public eye, where the powerful governor of New York could just be Alex, a man, a lover, a confidant. The first time we met there, I was nervous. My hands were shaking as I knocked on the door, unsure of what would happen next. But when he opened it, the tension melted away. He greeted me with a soft smile, a look that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. Without a word, he pulled me into his arms, and for a moment, we just held each other, both of us savoring the simplicity of the touch. We fell into a routine, meeting in that small apartment whenever he was in Manhattan. Our meetings were hurried and clandestine, but they were also filled with a raw honesty that I had never experienced before. In that apartment, the lines between our public personas and our private selves blurred. He wasn't the confident, polished politician the world knew, and I wasn't the composed, ambitious attorney. We were just two people, drawn together by something we couldn't quite explain. Our conversations were the kind that could last for hours, moving seamlessly from lighthearted banter to deep, philosophical discussions. We talked about politics, of course, how could we not? But it wasn't the usual rhetoric or rehearsed talking points. Alex shared his frustrations with the limitations of the system, the battles he fought behind closed doors, and the compromises he hated making. He spoke about his vision for the state, his dreams of making real, lasting change, and the challenges he faced every day from those who were more concerned with power than with progress. I hate it sometimes, he admitted one night, running a hand through his hair in frustration. We were sitting on the couch, the lights dim, the city's glow filtering in through the window. The politics of it all. The games, the lies, the manipulation. It's exhausting. I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Then why do you do it? I asked softly, genuinely curious. He turned to me, his expression softening. Because I believe in it, he said simply. I believe that I can make a difference. And sometimes, that's the only thing that keeps me going. It was moments like these when I realized how much I was falling for him. It wasn't just his charm or his good looks, it was his passion, his conviction, the way he spoke with a sincerity that seemed so rare in the political world. He was flawed, yes, but he was also real in a way that I hadn't expected. But our conversations weren't always serious. We laughed together, shared stories from our pasts, and joked about the absurdities of our respective professions. He teased me about my meticulous nature, calling me the only lawyer who could out-argue the entire state senate, while I teased him about his tendency to give long-winded speeches, even when he was just ordering coffee. In those moments, it was easy to forget the risks we were taking, to pretend that we were just a normal couple, free from the constraints of our public lives. Still, there were times when the reality of our situation loomed over us, an unspoken tension that neither of us could ignore. We both knew the stakes, the political ramifications, the potential scandals, the way our relationship could unravel everything we had worked so hard to build. But it didn't matter. The pull between us was too strong, the fire we felt too consuming to resist. It was as if we were standing in the middle of a field of dry grass, and every touch, every kiss, was a spark that set the whole place ablaze. One evening, as we lay together on the couch, his head resting on my lap, I ran my fingers through his hair, tracing the lines of his jaw. He looked up at me, his expression unguarded, raw. "Do you ever think about what would happen if this got out?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with a vulnerability I hadn't heard before. "All the time," I admitted. "It scares me, Alex." "It terrifies me." He reached up, taking my hand in his, pressing it to his lips. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered. "But I don't know how to keep this from falling apart." I swallowed hard, feeling the familiar ache of doubt creep in. "Maybe we're being foolish," I said softly. "Maybe we're playing with fire, and it's only a matter of time before we get burned." He sat up, cupping my face in his hands, forcing me to look at him. "Then let it burn," he said fiercely. "I'd rather have this, have you, for as long as we can, than spend my life wondering what might have been." In that moment, I realized how deep I had fallen, how completely I was wrapped up in him. I was willing to risk everything, my career, my reputation, even my sense of self, for the chance to be with him. And I knew that he felt the same way. It was reckless, it was dangerous, but it was real. It was the kind of love that consumed you, that left no room for caution or second guessing. We both knew it couldn't last. There was a ticking clock hanging over us, a countdown to the inevitable moment when everything would come crashing down. But neither of us wanted to face that reality just yet. Instead, we chose to live in the present, in the stolen hours we had together, where we could pretend, just for a little while, that the world outside didn't exist. And so, we continued to meet, week after week, like two fugitives hiding from a world that would never understand. We clung to each other like lifelines, knowing that we were standing on the edge of a precipice, but unwilling to step back. It was a love built on borrowed time, and we both knew it. But it didn't matter. We were addicted to the fire, and neither of us was ready to let it go. It was a cool autumn night, the kind where the chill in the air made the city seem sharper, clearer, as though everything was outlined in silver. We were in the apartment, the lights turned low, a soft golden glow illuminating the room. Outside, the sounds of Manhattan hummed like a distant symphony, car horns, laughter, the occasional wail of a siren. But inside, it was just the two of us, cocooned in a bubble of stolen time. I remember how we sat there on the couch, wrapped up in a thick woolen blanket, with his head resting against my shoulder. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the jasmine-scented candle I had brought with me, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was one of those rare, quiet moments when we weren't in a rush, when we could simply be together without the pressure of the outside world clawing at the door. Alexander was silent, unusually so. He stared out the window, his gaze far away, lost somewhere in the sea of lights that stretched across the city skyline. I could feel the tension in his body, a coiled spring of exhaustion and stress that he tried so hard to hide from everyone else, but never from me. I ran my fingers through his hair, gently massaging his scalp, hoping to ease the lines of worry that creased his forehead. He sighed deeply, the sound more like a release than an expression of contentment. "I've never felt as free as I do when I'm with you, Rebecca," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. It was a confession, raw and unfiltered, the kind he never made in the daylight hours when he wore the mask of the unflappable governor. "My life in the governor's office, it's like a gilded cage. It's beautiful, it's powerful, but it's still a cage. And you're the door I've been searching for. You're my way out." His words hit me like a wave, crashing over me with a force I wasn't prepared for. I tightened my arms around him, pulling him closer. I didn't say anything, I couldn't. What words could possibly convey the emotions churning inside me? The mix of joy and sorrow, the elation of being his escape, juxtaposed against the heavy knowledge that this, whatever we were, existed only in the shadows. In the daylight, he was Alexander Shaw, the governor of New York, a man with responsibilities, a family, a public image to uphold. But here, in this tiny apartment, he was just Alex, a man who needed me as much as I needed him. We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other, our breaths in sync, our bodies fitting together like two halves of a broken shell. He held me as though I was his lifeline, as though letting go would mean drowning. And in a way, it did. The world outside was an ocean of expectations, demands, and pressures that neither of us could withstand alone. "I can't do this without you," he murmured into my hair, his voice rough with emotion. It was the first time he had admitted it so openly, the first time he had laid his vulnerability bare. I pulled back slightly to look at him, cupping his face in my hands. His eyes were dark, searching mine as though he was trying to find some kind of reassurance, some promise that I would stay, despite the impossibility of it all. "You don't have to," I whispered back, pressing my forehead against his. "I'm here, Alex. I'm not going anywhere." He closed his eyes, leaning into my touch, and I saw the smallest, almost imperceptible shudder pass through him. It was like he was letting go of a weight he'd been carrying for far too long. It's ironic, isn't it? He said, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. I spend every day making decisions that affect millions of people, but the one thing I want most in this world is the one thing I can never have fully. I knew what he meant. We were living on borrowed time, dancing on the edge of a knife that could cut us both down at any moment. We had created this little bubble of a world where it was just the two of us, but it couldn't last. Sooner or later, reality would burst through, shattering the fragile sanctuary we had built. I wish things were different, I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the sound of the city outside. I wish we didn't have to hide. He opened his eyes, looking at me with a kind of fierce tenderness that made my heart ache. I don't care about the hiding, he said, shaking his head. If this is the price I have to pay to have you, then it's worth it. Every stolen moment, every secret, every risk. It's worth it, Rebecca. You're worth it. Tears stung my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I wasn't a woman who cried easily, but there was something about his words, about the raw sincerity in his voice, that broke through the walls I had built up over the years. I blinked them back, not wanting him to see, but he reached up, gently brushing a tear away with his thumb. Hey, he said softly, his expression softening as he cupped my face in his hands. Don't cry. Please don't cry. I gave him a shaky smile. I'm not crying, I lied, my voice choked. He smiled back, a sad, knowing smile that told me he saw through me completely. You're a terrible liar, you know that? I laughed, a sound that was half sob, half genuine amusement. And you're impossible, I retorted, leaning in to kiss him, needing to feel the warmth of his lips on mine, needing the connection to ground me. We kissed slowly, tenderly, as though we were both trying to imprint this moment into our memories, a shield against the inevitable storm that was brewing on the horizon. I could taste the salt of my own tears on his lips, could feel the urgency in the way he held me, as though he was trying to absorb me into his very being. When we finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. Promise me something, he said quietly, his voice rough. Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll remember this. Remember us, like this, in this moment. I promise, I whispered back, sealing the vow with a kiss. In that small apartment, in the middle of Manhattan, we floated together in a universe of our own making, a universe where we weren't bound by the rules of politics or society. It was a fleeting illusion, a beautiful lie that we told ourselves, because the truth was too painful to face. And for that night, for just a few hours, we allowed ourselves to believe it. The illusion of our private world was shattered one ordinary afternoon. I was sitting at my desk at the law firm, immersed in the details of a complicated merger case. It had been one of those rare, quiet days, where the steady rhythm of work had lulled me into a false sense of security. My phone buzzed on the desk beside me, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before answering, a small knot of unease forming in the pit of my stomach. Rebecca Foster speaking, I said, trying to keep my voice professional, even though something about the silence on the other end of the line felt off. Miss Foster, a male voice replied, cold and precise, like the sharp edge of a knife slicing through the air. There was no introduction, no pleasantries, just the kind of tone that demanded attention. This is David Carlisle, Chief of Staff to Governor Shaw. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. I had heard of David Carlisle many times. He was Alex's right-hand man, the gatekeeper who controlled access to the governor and orchestrated the intricacies of his political machine. He was known for his ruthlessness, for being the kind of man who would do whatever it took to protect his boss's career. But I had never met him, never even spoken to him before. The fact that he was calling me now, directly, sent a chill down my spine. Yes, Mr. Carlisle, I managed to say, forcing myself to remain calm. How can I help you? He didn't waste any time. We need to have a conversation about your Involvement with the governor, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, as if he were discussing a routine policy matter. You may think you've been discreet, but you've underestimated the level of scrutiny we operate under. My heart skipped a beat, a cold sweat breaking out along the back of my neck. I gripped the edge of my desk, feeling the sharp wood bite into my palm. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, though the lie felt weak, even to my own ears. Let's not play games, Ms. Foster, Carlyle cut in sharply. We know everything. The late-night meetings. The East Village apartment. Your relationship with Governor Shaw has not gone unnoticed. His words were like ice water, dousing the fire that had been burning between Alex and me. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the full weight of what he was saying. They knew. Of course they knew. The governor's team wasn't made up of fools. They were seasoned political operatives, trained to detect the slightest whisper of scandal before it could grow into a full-blown storm. But I had let myself believe we were safe, that we could keep our secret hidden. What do you want? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My hand trembled as I held the phone to my ear, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. I want you to end it, Carlyle said bluntly. Whatever this affair is, it stops now. If you care at all about the governor, about his career, you will walk away and never look back. Do you understand me? His voice was cold, almost clinical, as though he were discussing a surgical procedure rather than dismantling the most meaningful relationship I'd ever had. I felt a surge of anger rise up inside me, a hot, bitter wave of fury that threatened to spill over. And if I don't? I challenged, though my voice wavered. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer, almost pitying. If you don't, he said slowly, we will make sure this story finds its way into the hands of the press. And I promise you, it won't just be your reputation that's destroyed, Miss Foster. The governor's entire career will be in ruins. The scandal would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for everyone involved. Including you. I felt the room begin to spin, the walls closing in around me. The threat was clear, a guillotine hanging over both our heads, ready to fall at the slightest provocation. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. You're willing to destroy him to save him? I asked, incredulous. It's not about what I'm willing to do, Carlyle replied, almost casually. It's about what needs to be done. Governor Shaw has a future to protect. A legacy. You're just collateral damage. Collateral damage. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I had known, of course, that our relationship was risky. I had known that there were consequences. But I had never fully considered what it would mean to be discarded, to be swept aside like a piece on a chessboard, sacrificed for the greater game. I won't let you threaten me, I said, my voice hardening, though it was taking every ounce of strength I had to keep the fear out of my voice. This isn't a threat, Miss Foster, Carlyle said calmly. It's a reality check. You need to make a choice. Walk away, and this can all go back to the way it was. Or stay, and watch as everything you built comes crashing down around you. It's up to you. Before I could respond, he hung up, the line going dead with a cold, final click. I stared at the phone in my hand, my knuckles white from the force of my grip. My entire body was shaking, a visceral reaction I couldn't control. I dropped the phone onto the desk, pressing a hand to my mouth to stifle a sob. It was in that moment, standing there in my office, surrounded by the familiar trappings of my professional life, that I realized just how deep I had fallen into this dangerous game. I wasn't just in love with a man, I was entangled in a web of power, politics, and manipulation far beyond anything I had ever dealt with before. And now, I was caught in the crossfire, a pawn in a battle I hadn't even known was being fought. I sank into my chair, staring blankly at the papers in front of me. Legal briefs, case files, documents I had once found comfort in, now seemed meaningless. I had built my entire life on logic and control, on the belief that I could manage any situation with the right strategy. But this was a game I wasn't prepared for, a battlefield where the rules were written in invisible ink, where one wrong move could cost us everything. I knew I needed to talk to Alex, to warn him, to figure out what our next step would be. But as I reached for my phone again, my hand froze. What if Carlisle was right? What if the only way to protect him was to walk away, to sever the ties between us before they tightened into a noose around both our necks? I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, a hot, stinging sensation that I couldn't blink away. I had never been a woman who cried easily, but now the tears came freely, spilling down my cheeks as I realized the full weight of the choice before me. To stay and fight, or to leave and save us both from destruction. In that moment, I understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't just about who held it. It was about who was willing to wield it, and at what cost. After the call with David Carlisle, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into a chasm of uncertainty. My mind was racing with questions, fears, and doubts that I couldn't escape. I knew what I needed to do. I had to end it. The risk was too great, the stakes too high. I spent the next few days avoiding Alex's calls and texts, throwing myself into work in a desperate attempt to regain control over my spiraling life. I convinced myself that it was for the best, that cutting off contact was the only way to protect him, to protect us both from the ruin that loomed on the horizon. But Alex wasn't the kind of man who accepted silence. He showed up at my apartment one evening, unannounced, with a look of determination that sent my heart into my throat. I hadn't seen him in nearly a week, and the sight of him standing in the doorway, his eyes filled with worry, broke through every wall I had tried to put up. "Rebecca," he said, his voice raw with emotion. He stepped inside before I could respond, closing the door behind him. "Why have you been avoiding me?" "What's going on?" I turned away, unable to look at him, afraid that if I met his eyes, I would crumble. "We need to stop this," I said, forcing the words out. They tasted bitter, like ashes on my tongue. "It's too dangerous." "People know, Alex. Carlisle called me. He knows everything." Alex's expression darkened at the mention of Carlisle's name. He crossed the room in 2 quick strides, taking my hands in his. "I don't care what Carlisle knows," he said fiercely. "He doesn't control my life, and he doesn't control us." I pulled my hands away, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. "But he can destroy us, Alex. He can leak this to the press, turn it into a scandal that will ruin your career. And for what? For a relationship that we can't even have in the open?" "Don't say that," he whispered, his voice breaking. He reached for me again, cupping my face in his hands. "I'm not giving this up, Rebecca. I'm not giving you up. We can figure this out, together. We won't let anyone interfere. Just trust me." His words were like a balm to my frayed nerves, soothing the fear that had taken root in my chest. I wanted so badly to believe him, to sink into the safety of his arms, and let him shoulder the weight of our problems. But the rational part of my brain, the lawyer who had spent years navigating the treacherous waters of New York politics, knew the truth. Alex Shaw was the governor of New York. He had a legacy, a family, a reputation that he had built over decades. He couldn't afford to throw it all away for me, no matter how much he cared. "I do trust you," I said quietly, pulling back from him, my voice trembling. "But this is bigger than us. It's not just about what we want. It's about the consequences, the fallout. If this comes out..." I never got to finish my sentence. The vibration of my phone on the kitchen counter interrupted me, and I turned to glance at the screen. My blood ran cold. It was a notification from a news site, and the headline made my heart stop. "Breaking news: Scandal erupts as alleged affair between Governor Shaw and prominent attorney leaks online." I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me. I grabbed the phone with shaking hands, opening the article. There, splashed across the screen, was a photo of us. It wasn't anything overtly intimate, just a fleeting moment captured by a long-lens camera. We were standing outside the East Village apartment, our fingers barely brushing as he reached out to me. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture of affection, but in the context of the article, it was damning. "Oh my God," I breathed, my voice a strangled whisper. I looked up at Alex, who had moved behind me to read over my shoulder. His face drained of color, the confidence and resolve from moments before evaporating in an instant. "How?" he muttered, his voice laced with disbelief. "How did they get this?" "We were so careful." "It doesn't matter how," I said, panic rising in my chest. "It's out now, Alex." "They know." The article was spreading like wildfire. Within minutes, my phone was flooded with notifications, messages from colleagues, missed calls from unknown numbers, and emails from reporters asking for comments. I could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thin as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. "We need to get ahead of this," Alex said, his voice filled with a kind of steely resolve that both reassured and terrified me. "I have to make a statement, deny everything. We can still control the narrative." "Deny it?" I echoed, incredulous. "Alex, there's a photo. They've got proof." "How can you possibly deny this?" He looked at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with a desperation I had never seen before. "We have to try," he insisted. "If I admit it, it's over. My career, everything I've worked for, it's gone. I can't let that happen." His words cut through me like a knife. This was the moment I had dreaded, the moment I knew would come eventually, but had prayed would never arrive. He was choosing his career, his legacy, over us. I had known it would happen, but the pain of it still took my breath away. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice hollow. "You're going to go on television and lie? Pretend like this never happened, like I never meant anything to you?" "It's not like that," he said urgently, stepping closer, reaching for me. "Rebecca, please, you have to understand. This is bigger than both of us. I can't just throw everything away." I pulled back, shaking my head, tears blurring my vision. "I do understand, Alex," I whispered. "I understand perfectly. You were never going to choose me. You were always going to choose this, the power, the politics, the image." He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the TV in the corner of the room flickered on, filling the space with the harsh light of a breaking news report. There he was, standing at a podium in the press room, flanked by his aides. He looked tired, worn down, but his expression was resolute. "I want to address the rumors circulating about me today," he said, his voice strong and unwavering. "I categorically deny any inappropriate relationship. These accusations are false and politically motivated. I have always conducted myself with the utmost integrity, and I will not be distracted by baseless gossip." I watched in silence, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, as he lied to the world. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He played his part perfectly, the seasoned politician who knew how to spin a story, how to manipulate the narrative. The screen went black, and I realized I was crying, the tears streaming down my face unchecked. Alex turned to me, his own eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored my own. "Rebecca," he began, but I shook my head, cutting him off. "Don't," I said, my voice breaking. "Just don't." In that moment, I knew it was over. The bubble had burst, the illusion shattered. We had tried to hold on to something impossible, and now we were left with nothing but the pieces of a love that had been doomed from the start. I walked out of the apartment without another word, the sound of the door closing behind me echoing like the final note of a tragic symphony. The press conference was scheduled for the following afternoon, and I had barely slept the night before. My mind was a whirlwind of dread and anxiety. The phone calls had come in waves throughout the night, from my firm's partners, from colleagues, from friends who had seen the news and were either furious or sympathetic, depending on their perspective. By morning, my entire world felt like it had been dismantled, piece by piece. I wasn't Rebecca Foster, the respected attorney anymore. I was the center of a scandal that had captured the entire nation's attention, the face of an affair with the most powerful man in New York. I arrived at the venue in a daze, barely aware of the security team ushering me through the back entrance. The room where the press conference was being held felt suffocating, packed to capacity with journalists, photographers, and news crews. The heat of the lights bore down on me, making the air feel thick and hard to breathe. I could hear the cacophony of voices, the hum of anticipation as everyone waited for the moment they had been promised, a live, public reckoning. The flashes from the cameras were blinding, strobing across the room like a chaotic lightning storm. I took a deep breath, standing behind the podium, trying to steady myself. The noise of the room fell to a low murmur, a collective breath held in anticipation. I glanced to the side, catching sight of Alex standing just beyond the curtain, hidden from the view of the crowd. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, I saw the raw pain etched into his face. He looked like a man on the edge of a precipice, ready to fall, but desperately trying to hold on. But then the moment was gone, and I was alone in the spotlight. Ms. Foster, over here. A journalist's voice pierced the silence, sharp and demanding. Can you confirm the nature of your relationship with Governor Shaw? I swallowed hard, the taste of fear bitter on my tongue. I knew what they wanted. They wanted a confession, a headline. They wanted the story that would sell newspapers and drive ratings. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the entire room pressing down on me, the collective gaze of hundreds of people who were ready to dissect my every word, every gesture. Rebecca, another voice called out, louder this time, more insistent. Did you have an affair with the governor? Did you know he was married? How long has this been going on? The questions came like rapid-fire bullets, each one designed to pierce through the thin armor I had managed to put up. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my heartbeat pounding in my ears like a drum. The words I needed to say, the lie that everyone expected me to tell, stuck in my throat like a jagged piece of glass. And then, I saw it, the faces of the people in the room, the expectant looks, the eager eyes waiting for me to break. This wasn't about truth. It was about spectacle. They didn't care about the real story, about the complicated, messy reality of what had happened between Alex and me. They wanted a villain, and they had already decided that it was me. I took a deep breath, feeling the calm settle over me like the eye of a storm. I glanced at the cameras, the red lights blinking back at me, signaling that we were live. There was no going back now. I couldn't change what had happened, couldn't rewrite the story that had already been told 1,000 times over in the tabloids and the morning news shows. Yes, I said, my voice cutting through the noise like a blade. It was quiet but clear, and the room fell into a stunned silence. Yes, I had a relationship with Governor Shaw. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a second, there was nothing but silence, and then the room exploded. Reporters shouted over each other, their voices a chaotic roar. The flashes from the cameras came in rapid succession, blinding me as the questions came pouring in, each one louder and more accusatory than the last. Did you love him? A voice called out, almost drowned out by the others. I looked directly into the camera, my eyes burning with unshed tears. Yes, I said slowly, deliberately. I loved him. The room erupted into chaos, a wave of noise that crashed over me like a tidal wave. I could see the reactions in the crowd, shock, outrage, a few sympathetic faces, but mostly the gleam of triumph in the eyes of those who had been waiting for this moment. They had their confession, their headline, "The Governor's Mistress Speaks Out." I knew what was coming next. The fallout would be swift and brutal. Alex's political opponents would seize this scandal like a gift from the heavens, using it to dismantle everything he had built. The public would vilify him, brand him as another politician who couldn't keep his personal life in check. And I would be the woman who had brought him down, the Jezebel who had dared to love a man who was untouchable. As the reporters continued to shout questions at me, I felt a strange kind of calm wash over me, a numbness that spread from my chest to the tips of my fingers. This was it. This was the end of the line. I had made my choice, and there was no turning back. I stepped back from the podium, the noise of the room fading into a distant hum. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I saw Alex pushing through the curtain, striding towards me with a look of determination that took my breath away. He grabbed the microphone, his knuckles white as he held onto it like it was the only thing keeping him anchored. "I am resigning from my position as governor, effective immediately," he said, his voice steady, but I could hear the tremble beneath it. "I have made mistakes, and I take full responsibility for them. This scandal is my fault, and I will not allow it to continue to be a distraction from the important work that needs to be done for the people of New York." The room fell silent once more, the weight of his words sinking in. He looked at me then, and in that moment, it felt like it was just the two of us again, standing in the small apartment in the East Village, holding on to each other like the world was ending. "I'm sorry," he mouthed, his eyes filled with tears. I nodded, unable to speak, my own tears spilling over. I turned and walked out, pushing through the crowd of reporters who parted like the Red Sea, their cameras trained on me, capturing every second of my exit. Outside, the sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. I stood there on the steps of the building, feeling the first cold drops hit my skin. I tilted my head back, letting the rain wash over me, mingling with the tears on my cheeks. I had come here as Rebecca Foster, a lawyer with a promising career. I was leaving as the governor's mistress, a title that would follow me like a shadow for the rest of my life. But as I stood there, drenched in the rain, I realized something. I had loved him. Truly, deeply. And for a brief moment in time, he had loved me too. In a world where power and ambition often drown out everything else, we had found something real, even if it couldn't last. I took a deep breath and walked down the steps, disappearing into the crowd. The life I had known was over, but a new chapter was beginning. And though I didn't know where it would lead, I knew I would survive. Because I had faced the storm, and I was still standing. I left New York in the early hours of a cold, gray morning. The city that had once felt like the center of my universe now loomed behind me like a distant memory, a shadow of a life I could no longer claim. I packed what little I could fit into my car, just a few clothes, some books, and the remnants of a life that had crumbled in the public eye. The rest I left behind, the corner office in Manhattan, the bustling streets, the apartment that had once been my sanctuary. It was easier that way, like shedding a skin that no longer fit. I drove west without a plan, without a destination in mind. I only knew that I needed distance, a physical separation from the chaos and the heartbreak that New York had become. I needed a place where I could be someone else, somewhere no one knew my name or the scandal that had unraveled everything I had worked so hard to build. I ended up in a small coastal town on the western edge of the country, far from the noise and the flashing cameras. It was a sleepy place, the kind where everyone knows everyone, but no one asks too many questions. The town itself was quaint, with narrow streets lined with weathered houses, a lighthouse perched on a rocky cliff, and a shoreline that stretched as far as the eye could see. The ocean was a constant presence, the waves crashing against the rocks like a lullaby that soothed the raw edges of my broken heart. I rented a small cottage near the beach, a modest place with peeling paint and creaky floors, but it was quiet and private, and that was all I needed. I spent my days trying to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. I found work at a local bookstore, a far cry from the high-stakes world of corporate law, but it was comforting in its simplicity. I shelved books, helped customers find their next favorite read, and spent hours lost in the pages of novels that transported me far away from my own reality. But the nights were the hardest. The silence of the cottage was deafening, broken only by the sound of the waves outside my window. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories that refused to fade. I could still see his face, could still hear his voice whispering my name in the darkness. It was as if Alex was etched into my very soul, a permanent scar that no amount of time or distance could erase. I would walk along the beach every evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The ocean stretched out before me, vast and unending, a reminder of the distance I had put between myself and the life I once knew. Yet, no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the ghost of what we had shared. I couldn't forget the way he had looked at me, with a tenderness that made me believe, if only for a fleeting moment, that we could defy the odds. There were days when I felt a flicker of hope, when I thought maybe, just maybe, I could build something new from the ashes. But then the memories would come rushing back, like a tidal wave that pulled me under. I would see his face in the crowd, hear his laugh in the voice of a stranger, and I was back there again, in that tiny apartment in the East Village, wrapped up in a love that burned too brightly to last. I often found myself standing at the edge of the water, the cool waves lapping at my feet, staring out into the endless blue. It was a ritual, almost, a way of grounding myself, of feeling small in the face of something much larger than my own pain. The ocean was like Alex in a way, vast, unknowable, capable of both calm and chaos. It reminded me of the nights we spent together, the way his touch felt like a storm I couldn't escape, but didn't want to. I made friends in the town, slowly. They were kind people, gentle souls who seemed to sense that I was running from something, but they never pressed me for details. I was grateful for their quiet acceptance, for the way they welcomed me into their little community without prying. I would sit with them on the porch of the local diner, sipping coffee as we watched the boats bob in the harbor. It was peaceful, in a way I hadn't known I needed. But even in the stillness, even in the moments of tranquility, there was an ache that I couldn't shake. It wasn't the kind of pain that goes away with time, it was a deep, lingering sorrow that settled into my bones. It was the knowledge that I had loved him, truly loved him, and that love had been real, even if it was built on borrowed time and hidden behind closed doors. My story wasn't a fairy tale, wasn't the kind of love story that ends with a happily ever after. It was a story of mistakes and heartbreak, of choices made in the heat of passion that couldn't be undone. It was a story of the irresistible pull of a forbidden love, and the inevitable, crushing consequences that followed. I had been swept up in the whirlwind of his world, caught in a current I couldn't escape, and I had paid the price for those moments of bliss. I often wondered what Alex was doing now. I hadn't seen him since that last press conference, since he had resigned and disappeared from the public eye. I imagined him back in New York, rebuilding his life in the wake of the scandal, trying to put the pieces back together without me. I wondered if he thought of me, if he remembered the way we laughed together, the way we loved each other in the quiet hours of the night. Or if I had become just another chapter in a story he had long since closed. There were times when I wanted to reach out, to call him, to hear his voice just once more. But I knew better. I knew that whatever we had was over, that it existed in a place outside of reality, in a space where love could only live in the dark, away from the harsh light of the world. It was a love that could never survive the glare of the public eye, a love that was destined to fade as quickly as it had flared into existence. But even knowing that, I didn't regret it. I couldn't. Because for all the pain, for all the loss, there had been moments of pure, unfiltered joy. There had been laughter and passion and a connection so deep it felt like a lifeline. And that was something worth remembering. So I stayed in the little coastal town, living a quiet life that was a far cry from the one I had once known. I found peace in the small, simple things, in the sound of the waves, in the smell of the salt air, in the pages of the books I read late into the night. I was a different person now, shaped by the love I had found and lost, but I was still standing. I was still here. And every once in a while, when the sky turned a deep shade of violet and the sea shimmered like liquid silver, I would look out over the water and think of him. I would remember the way he had held me, the way he had whispered my name like it was the only thing that mattered. I would remember the love we shared, fleeting and fragile, a love that burned too brightly to last, but left its mark all the same. I would stand there, feeling the wind in my hair and the sand beneath my feet, and I would smile. Because even though our story hadn't ended the way I had hoped, it was still a story worth telling. And in the quiet of the evening, with the waves crashing at my feet, I felt like I was finally ready to let it go. To let him go. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.